evidence of a 2022 cover-up directly implicating Sasha. What began as a night of celebration turned into a national reckoning, unraveling layer by layer under the weight of truth, guilt, and privilege. Was Sasha Obama truly a beacon of progress, or the polished product of elite protection pushed too far? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the vaulted marble hall of the Capitol Civic Center, banners bearing the logo of Voices Forward fluttered under harsh white lights. Founded by Michelle Obama in her post-White House years, the nonprofit had become a cultural behemoth, celebrating youth empowerment, female leadership, and digital influence. But tonight, the air buzzed with a different charge. Sasha Obama, hailed by the event as a voice of her generation, was the headliner. Introduced as a beacon of Gen Z positivity, she walked onto the stage with a calm poise, bathed in soft blue spotlights and thunderous applause. Her social media clips, filtered and elegant, played behind her. Snippets of spoken-word poetry, climate awareness, and feminist solidarity. Yet below the surface, unease crept like a virus. Because in the fourth row sat Jasmine Crockett, a civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, her gaze fixed like steel on the stage. She had publicly condemned this very event last month, calling it a glorified influencer gala bankrolled by silent privilege. And now she was in the building. The press called it a powerful reunion of two Black female leaders. But Jasmine knew better. She didn't come for photo ops or sound bites. She came because something about this entire production didn't sit right. The scripted speeches, the curated praise, the unchallenged elevation of personalities over principle, everything reeked of performance. As applause roared again when Sasha smiled and waved, Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes didn't blink. In a room designed to celebrate harmony, she felt only pressure. Pressure to stay silent, pressure to conform, pressure to pretend. But Jasmine had never been good at pretending. She had spent her career tearing off polished veneers, and as she sat there, jaw set, breath held, she knew one thing for certain. This night wasn't going to go as planned. As Sasha stood on that stage soaking in applause, Jasmine sat stone still in the fourth row, because locked inside her briefcase wasn't just skepticism, it was a secret the world had never been allowed to hear. The envelope arrived quietly. No name, no return address, no stamps. Just her name on the front. It was left on her office desk like a whisper that dared to speak. Jasmine didn't open it for 3 days. She had seen her share of anonymous messages before. Most were fake, full of drama and lies. But something about this one felt different. Heavy, cold. Like it had been sent by someone who wasn't trying to get attention, but trying to tell the truth. When she finally opened it, her hands shook. Inside there were police documents, traffic photos, and something worse, a death certificate. It was from Los Angeles, dated July 18, 2022, 3:14 a.m. A man had been hit by a car and died instantly. His name, Luis Alberto Mendez, 36 years old. The report said he was a construction worker, walking home after a night shift. He had no family nearby, no lawyer, no papers. He was undocumented. The street was dark, no traffic lights, no signs, no cameras, except one. 4 grainy images were included. In the first, a black car entered the frame. In the second, headlights lit up a figure. In the third, that figure fell backward. In the fourth, only red taillights remained. The car had never stopped. Jasmine kept reading. A federal memo was included. Parts of it were blacked out, but she could still read words like public figure, no charges, and closed at the federal level. A letter from a powerful law firm in Washington followed. It didn't mention names. It just recommended quiet resolution to protect legacy and reputation. Jasmine had heard that tone before. In court, in politics. It was how people with power spoke when they wanted someone to disappear without a mess. But the worst part wasn't the reports. It was a small, torn piece of notebook paper stuck in the back. It had just one sentence, written in shaky handwriting. She was the one behind the wheel. No name, no explanation. But Jasmine didn't need one. Every file, every photo, Every word pointed in one direction. Someone had killed that man, and someone else had made sure it never became a headline. Louis was poor. He was undocumented. He was invisible. And that made it easy for the system to pretend his life didn't matter. Jasmine sat in silence for a long time. Her heart pounded. Her hands were ice cold. But her mind was clear. This wasn't a traffic accident. It was a decision. A decision to protect someone with status by erasing someone without it. And if no one else would speak for Louise, she would. Loudly, publicly, even if it meant burning bridges with the most powerful names in the country. Because this wasn't just injustice, it was silence. Paid for and protected. And she had no intention of letting it stand. She hadn't planned to speak, not that night, but sitting there, folder pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Watching applause drown out the truth, Jasmine knew. If she stayed silent now, she'd be just another part of the cover-up. She stood up slowly, not with fanfare, not with fury, just steady, with purpose. Her heels clicked once, twice against the marble floor as she moved into the center aisle. The heavy folder clutched tightly in her hand. Heads turned. Phones were lifted. A few aides leaned forward, sensing something was off, but too late. Jasmine didn't wait for a mic. She walked straight toward the stage where the host was still smiling awkwardly, mid-sentence. His voice faltered when he saw her. The room wasn't built for interruption, but Jasmine's presence didn't ask for space. It took it. She stepped onto the stage and turned to face the crowd. No one stopped her. No one dared, because something in her face told them this wasn't a political stunt. This was the beginning of something they didn't yet understand, but couldn't look away from. She raised the folder just enough so the cameras could see it. Her voice was clear, calm, deadly calm. Before we continue honoring legacies and rewriting headlines, she said, I have a question. Her gaze swept the room. No one breathed. Why is this woman, she continued, nodding slightly toward Sasha, being celebrated as a symbol of justice when she's never once been asked to answer for her past? The words weren't loud, but they cut through the silence like a blade. Every spotlight in the hall suddenly felt too bright, every seat too small. Sasha didn't move. Her face froze, not shocked, not angry, just hollow, like she knew this moment had always been waiting. Jasmine stepped closer to the podium, her tone tightening. We tell young people that truth matters, that accountability matters, but here we are, applauding someone who has never been held to the same standard as everyone else in this room, simply because her last name makes people nervous. A low murmur began in the back. Organizers whispered to each other, motioning toward security, but Jasmine didn't stop. She pointed to the folder. This is not rumor. This is not drama. This is what justice looks like when it's ignored, redacted, and buried. And tonight, I won't let that happen quietly. She lowered the folder, but her voice stayed sharp. We all know what this room was supposed to be. But if we want it to mean something, really mean something, then we have to stop pretending that influence is innocence. Sasha sat motionless. Her fingers gripped the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles went pale. She didn't speak. Not yet. Not a word. Around her, the room held its breath, frozen between the story they'd come to celebrate and the truth that had just walked on stage and shattered it. The silence after Jasmine's accusation wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, like the seconds before a building gives way. And in that stillness, all eyes turned to Sasha, waiting for the woman they'd come to celebrate to finally speak, not as a symbol, but as a human being under fire. Sasha stood, slowly, every movement deliberate, like someone trying not to step on glass. Her breath was steady, but her eyes gave her away. They weren't defiant. They were calculating, searching the crowd, measuring the moment, preparing the version of herself that could survive this. She walked toward the edge of the stage where the podium still stood, where Jasmine had planted her folder like a declaration of war. Sasha didn't touch it. She stood beside it, keeping her hands locked together in front of her. No microphone was needed. The room was quiet enough to hear the soft click of her heels when she shifted weight. I want to respond, she began. Her voice was calm, measured, but behind every syllable was a strain, like someone holding up a mask made of glass, hoping it wouldn't crack. I've stayed quiet for a reason. I've spent years being followed, photographed, assumed. I've had things said about me that were half true, twisted, or entirely made up. But I didn't come here to argue with anyone. She turned slightly to face Jasmine, not with aggression, but with controlled civility. What happened on July 18th, 2022 was tragic. But I wasn't driving. I was a passenger in the vehicle that night. The driver left the scene, yes, but I didn't. There it was, the line, the boundary, the carefully measured truth. Legal enough to sound right, vague enough to leave room for doubt. She let it settle into the room. Let the tension bend under the weight of her calm. I didn't lie, she added. I didn't hide anything. I gave a statement. I cooperated. I trusted the process. But Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. The tension in her jaw didn't release. The crowd might have paused, might have questioned their certainty for a moment. But Jasmine hadn't come with speculation. She had come with proof. Trusted the process, Jasmine echoed under her breath, just loud enough to be heard. Then louder. What process? The one that closes files when it sees a famous last name? The one that leaves a body in the street and no arrest report on record? Sasha didn't answer. She stood still, silent again. Jasmine stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the same sharp stillness she had carried since the first word left her mouth. She didn't look at Sasha now. She looked at the room. She turned her body just enough so the audience and cameras could see her clearly, then gestured to the screen behind them. The massive LED panel that had, minutes earlier, played Sasha's award montage. She nodded toward the technician at the edge of the stage. Can you cue the file marked Exhibit 1? There was a long pause. A tech worker hesitated, looking back and forth between the producer and a woman wearing a headset near the press box. But Jasmine's voice cut through their confusion. Do it. A few seconds passed. Then the screen flickered. The lights dimmed. The room grew darker not just physically, but emotionally, like something sacred was about to be breached. The video began with a timestamp, July 18th, 2022, 3:13:47 a.m. Sepulveda Boulevard / West 99th, Los Angeles. No audio, just grainy black and white footage from a stationary home security camera across the street. It showed a quiet residential block, dimly lit, trash bins lined along the curb. Nothing moved until, at 3:13:54, a dark luxury vehicle slid into frame from the right. It slowed at the corner, then coasted to a stop by the curb. A long 7 seconds passed. Then the driver's side door opened. A figure stepped out, female, tall, wearing a jacket over a tank top. One hand adjusting her hair, the other resting briefly on the roof of the car. The frame zoomed slightly. It was her, Sasha Obama. Not the passenger side, not the back seat, the driver's side. She paused in the middle of the frame, glancing around quickly, then turned her head away from the camera and walked toward the sidewalk, out of frame. No one else exited the car. The timestamp ran on for 20 more seconds. Then the screen froze. Sasha's image, crystal clear in that final still, hung above them like a ghost. No one in the room moved. No one had to, because there was nothing left to say. Jasmine turned this time to face Sasha directly. Her voice was quiet, but each word dropped like stone. You weren't in the passenger seat. You stepped out of the driver's side, alone. You looked around. You left before police arrived. That's not an opinion. That's not politics. That's video. That's fact. Sasha didn't speak. Her eyes were wide, her mouth just slightly open. Not in panic, but in that hollow numbness that comes right before panic hits. Jasmine didn't push further. She didn't need to. The room was doing the work now, processing, recalibrating, reevaluating every word Sasha had spoken just moments earlier. A murmur rose from the press section. Whispers turned into typing, typing into headlines. Jasmine looked back at the crowd, not with triumph, not with spite, but with a kind of sorrow, a weariness that came from knowing she hadn't wanted this. She had hoped Sasha would tell the truth, had hoped the system would do the right thing long before now, but it hadn't. So Jasmine had brought the truth with her, And she had opened it, frame by frame. The lights in the hall stayed low, the screens still frozen behind them. Sasha remained standing, shoulders pulled tight, chin lifted just barely, but her silence said everything. In that moment, she wasn't an icon. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a villain. She was just exposed. The room had barely recovered from what it witnessed. The air was still thick with disbelief. But truth, Jasmine was learning, doesn't echo in power. It collides with it. And sometimes it's power that hits back first. The letter wasn't made public right away. It didn't need to be. What mattered was where it went and who saw it first. On official stationery from the office of Michelle Obama, it was delivered directly to the Speaker of the House, hand-carried by a trusted liaison, and marked confidential, internal congressional review only. But by nightfall, 3 news networks were already quoting its contents. Someone had leaked it, and not by accident. The timing was too precise, the headlines too synchronized. Former First Lady expresses deep concern over Crockett's conduct. Obama camp accuses Congresswoman of abuse of office. The framing was immediate and unmistakably strategic. The language inside the letter was calm, formal, and devastating. It expressed deep disappointment over what it described as a breach of institutional dignity and condemned Jasmine's actions as a reckless misuse of congressional stature for personal gain. Nowhere in the 3-page letter was the word video mentioned. Not once. No denial, no rebuttal, no explanation. Instead, it leaned on a much older tactic, shifting the spotlight, reframing the event. The letter warned that Jasmine's actions had undermined the spirit of civic unity and set a dangerous precedent by using the House chamber as a stage for targeted personal attacks. It stopped short of demanding censure, but its final paragraph urged appropriate review and internal consequences. Jasmine read it twice, then a third time. She was standing alone in her office, the overhead lights off, the city glowing dim outside the tall Capitol windows. The printed copy lay flat on her desk, her fingers pressed into the margin as if she were holding it down to keep it from floating away. She wasn't surprised, not really, but the depth of the betrayal still hit like ice water. She had grown up respecting Michelle Obama, admiring her, quoting her, and now she was being named, indirectly but undeniably, as a threat to the very integrity of the institution she had fought to enter. Outside her door, staffers whispered. One had already been approached by a senior aide to the Speaker, asking if Jasmine intended to walk back any part of her remarks. Another had received a text warning that donors were extremely uncomfortable in reconsidering their alignment. The backlash was moving fast, not because what Jasmine had said was false, but because it had made people powerful enough to call it dangerous. By morning, op-eds began to trickle in. One called her a wrecking ball in a silk blazer. Another, more venomous, accused her of carving up a fellow black woman for applause. Cable anchors, one after another, took turns debating her tone, her motives, her judgment. Not the video, not the death, not the silence that came before it. Just her, just Jasmine. The system hadn't denied the evidence. It hadn't even questioned it. Instead, it did what it always did when someone stepped out of line. It turned her into the problem. Jasmine stood still for a long moment, staring at the words. Weaponizing personal accusations under the guise of civic duty. That phrase echoed louder than the rest, as if telling the truth, when no one else had dared to, was now a form of violence. As if speaking the name of a dead man and showing what the system had erased was somehow more offensive than the silence that buried him. She didn't slam the letter. She didn't curse or pace the room. She simply folded the page in half, then again, and slipped it into her desk drawer without a word. Not out of fear, out of resolve. Because this was never going to be easy. And now it was real. The knives had come out. The machine had begun to turn. And Jasmine Crockett, now in the center of a storm she hadn't started but refused to run from, knew one thing above all. She hadn't just challenged a person, she'd challenged a system. And systems don't bleed. They retaliate. The letter was a blade, but it wasn't the last one. By sunrise, the second came not on official paper, but from a tweet. And this time it wasn't bureaucracy striking back. It was legacy. It appeared at 7:12 a.m. sharp. No fanfare, no explanation. Just 16 words sent from the verified Twitter account of Michelle Obama. My family is imperfect, but we don't deserve to be made sacrifices in someone else's campaign for relevance. No name, no photo, no direct accusation, but no one needed context. The timing made it unmissable. The subtext made it unmistakable. And within minutes, those 16 words were everywhere. Looped on cable news banners, plastered across editorial pages, embedded in side-by-side image comparisons of Sasha's face in Jasmine's firelit speech. The media didn't ask what it meant. They asked what it should mean, and in that ambiguity, the weapon landed. Some called it grace under fire. Others called it an attack wrapped in elegance. Either way, it worked. The shift began almost immediately. Overnight, the story had been about the footage, the facts, the silence broken. Now the conversation turned. The question wasn't whether Sasha had lied, but whether Jasmine had gone too far in saying so. Across social media, the political trenches deepened. Progressive communities fractured visibly. One side hailed Jasmine as a woman brave enough to speak when silence had become complicity, calling her the voice accountability had been waiting for. But the backlash from her own side hit hardest. Critics, some with decades of activism behind them, accused her of pulling down another black woman to climb higher. Phrases like respectability warfare, black-on-black betrayal, and careerist feminism began to fill timelines and op-ed pages. Old allies grew cautious. Some went silent. Others spoke, but with caveats. On conservative networks, the narrative turned venomous. Jasmine was labeled an opportunist, a media vulture, even a cultural assassin targeting black icons for clout. Talk radio questioned her motives. Podcasts dissected her body language. Photos of her holding the manila folder were recirculated with captions like, "Ambition looks like this." And worst of all were the memes, edited clips that stripped her words of meaning and pumped them full of malice, spread not just by critics, but by those who once praised her. And still, the video remained untouched. No denial, no clarification, not a single word from Sasha or her team about what had been shown. Instead, it was Jasmine who became the subject. Not her evidence, not her intent, just her. Inside her office, Jasmine read Michelle's tweet 4 times, then once more. She didn't respond, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew whatever she said next would not be heard as truth, only as strategy. Her staff stood quiet, not out of fear, but because they could feel it too. The tide had turned, and it hadn't turned because she was wrong. It had turned because she had touched something people didn't want disturbed. A colleague she respected, someone who had marched beside her, fundraised with her, called her sister on the House floor, texted that morning, "You should have handled it privately. We protect each other, even when they mess up." Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't need to. That text said everything. Not about justice, but about how far people would go to preserve the illusion of it. She stood at the window, watching the Capitol lawn slowly brighten with the rising sun, and felt the weight pressing harder now. Not from guilt, but from the realization that she wasn't just fighting corruption, she was fighting comfort. And comfort had more defenders than truth ever would. In that moment, the tweet wasn't just a message, it was a mirror. And what it reflected was this: the price of truth wasn't just backlash, it was isolation. The world had tried to turn her into a villain, but Jasmine never needed their applause, only a signature, a statute, and the truth. And now it was time to let the law speak. At 9:03 a.m., under the dull gray sky that blanketed Washington like a curtain before the storm, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett entered room 2141 of the Rayburn House Office building. Not as a politician seeking attention, but as a woman holding a formal challenge to silence. Her face betrayed nothing. Her suit was navy, her heels deliberate. In her right hand was a sealed folder stamped with the House Oversight Committee's insignia. Inside, a motion that would change the rules of how power answered to truth. The request was clear, composed, and bold. Jasmine formally petitioned for a congressional investigation into the July 2022 car accident in Los Angeles, an event that, she argued, had been deliberately buried beneath a coordinated effort of bureaucratic misdirection, institutional silence, and legacy protection. As she stood before the committee panel, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The tension in the room did the speaking for her. She laid the folder on the podium with quiet finality, opened it, and read directly from the heart of her submission. This is not about political rivalry. This is about obstruction, and obstruction of justice under Title 18 of the U.S. Code is not a partisan issue. It is a federal crime. Then carefully she read the statute aloud. Whoever corruptly conceals, destroys, mutilates, or alters any record or document with the intent to impair its integrity or availability for use in an official proceeding shall be fined or imprisoned for up to 20 years. Every eye in the room locked on her. There was no theater here, no grandstanding, only the sharp, quiet certainty of someone who had been underestimated and who now came armed with law, not opinion. Her motion named specific offices, dates, and internal actions taken in the days following the crash. It pointed to the sudden closure of LAPD's open case file. It highlighted redacted memos from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And most controversially, it raised the possibility that top-level figures, former public officials connected to the executive branch, may have either directly or indirectly influenced the suppression of material evidence. The room didn't explode. It didn't have to. A single breath seemed to hang in the air. She continued, "This is not speculation. This is not vengeance. This is an invitation. No, a demand for the process we claim to believe in to be tested. Because if we let silence protect the powerful, we tell every voiceless victim in this country that justice is something they are too invisible to deserve." A beat passed. Then another. Then she said it. "If this body is to remain credible in the eyes of the people, then we must be willing to investigate not just those we oppose, but those we once admired." The implication hit like a gavel before any vote had even taken place. A former president of the United States could now be called to testify. Not for something he did, but for what he may have helped hide. For the machinery he may have allowed to run untouched while truth bled beneath it. By noon, the Speaker's office released a statement. They had reviewed the motion. The supporting evidence was substantial. A preliminary emergency hearing would be scheduled within the week. No names were confirmed, but the headline wrote itself: Congresswoman Crockett forces emergency hearing over alleged federal obstruction in 2022 fatal crash. Outside, the building was already surrounded by cameras. Inside, Jasmine remained in her office, surrounded by silence. Not triumphant, not shaken, just steady. She had moved the system. Now it would have to move back, or answer why it refused. The legal storm was growing, but the emotional war had already reached a boiling point. And when Sasha's voice finally surfaced, it didn't come through a press release or lawyer's statement. It came as a cry, unfiltered and devastating. The leak didn't arrive with fireworks. No press conference, no insider expose. Just a quiet drop at 2:36 a.m. An audio file, anonymously uploaded to a journalist's private channel, marked with one word: recording. At first, few believed it was real. The voice was too raw, too fragile, too unlike the public image so many had seen. But within hours, forensic analysts confirmed its authenticity. By dawn, it had been played over 100,000 times, and by noon, it was headline news. The clip was just under 90 seconds. It opened mid-breath, Sasha's voice trembling. "I didn't mean to kill anyone," she said, her words cracking as if spoken through clenched teeth. "I didn't know what to do. I just panicked." Then came the line that would be burned into every broadcast that day. "They won't care what happened. They'll just hate me because I'm Sasha Obama." There was no yelling, no screaming, just quiet crying, controlled, contained. Almost like she had tried not to let herself fall apart, but failed halfway through. In the background, a second voice, presumably her mother's, could be heard murmuring something soft, unintelligible, like someone trying to comfort a drowning person from the shore. The recording cut off with a long pause. No dramatic ending, just silence. But it said more than any defense ever could. The country cracked wide open again. Some saw it as the first real glimpse of the unbearable weight Sasha had carried in silence. Commentators described the recording as a rare, unguarded moment from a woman born into impossible expectations. A few argued that it proved she wasn't cold or calculating, that she was young, scared, and suffocating under a last name too heavy for anyone to carry alone. Sympathy surged. Supporters posted stories of public shame, misjudged moments, second chances. But just as many didn't accept the tears as redemption. To others, it was a manipulation, a perfectly timed leak designed to tilt public emotion and reframe guilt as pain. On conservative outlets, pundits accused Sasha of hiding behind her family's name while playing the victim. Some voices on the left were just as sharp. No one is saying she wanted someone to die, one activist wrote, but someone did, and she walked away while he bled on the sidewalk. That's not trauma. That's privilege. A single tweet, retweeted over 300,000 times, summed up the rage. You don't get to cry about being hated when someone else never got the chance to be heard. Luis is dead. Sasha is trending. The contrast was brutal. Luis Alberto Mendez, the man killed that night, had no microphone, no recordings, no soft voice on tape. He had a name on a redacted report and a grieving family the country still hadn't seen. In the face of that silence, Sasha's voice, however human, however shaken, felt to many like a luxury. Inside Capitol Hill, the impact was immediate. Some lawmakers who had previously wavered in support of the investigation now called for a pause, citing emotional volatility and unfair media pressure. Others doubled down, saying the recording made the investigation more necessary than ever. This isn't about whether she cried, Jasmine Crockett told a small circle of press later that afternoon. This is about whether someone died and the system looked away. Jasmine didn't attack Sasha for crying. She didn't even mention the clip publicly. But those close to her said she listened to it in her office alone, just once, then closed the browser window, folded her hands and said simply, "It's not supposed to feel easy," because the truth never did, and neither did justice. The country had heard Sasha cry behind closed doors, but now for the first time, she would have to speak in public, with the lights on, the cameras live, and the one woman who refused to let the truth die sitting 6 feet across from her. The studio was built for spectacle, but the air inside felt like a courtroom, tight, electric, breathless. CNN had branded it The Reckoning, a national conversation. The set was stripped of distraction, no scrolling news feed, no flashing graphics, just 2 chairs on opposite sides of a round table, harsh downlighting, and a single camera tracking both faces. Jasmine Crockett sat on the left, back straight, hands clasped. Sasha Obama sat on the right, shoulders lower, eyes darker than the public had ever seen them. There was no moderator, no crowd, just 2 microphones and 20 million people watching from across the country. For the first 3 minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Jasmine broke the silence. "This isn't easy, for either of us. But I didn't come here to make this comfortable. I came here to make it count." Her voice was even, but the edge was unmistakable. Sasha looked down, then back up. She opened her mouth once, stopped, then tried again. "I lied," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut like a blade in a silent room. "I drove the car that night." The words landed like a physical blow. Audible gasps from the control room leaked faintly into the audio feed. Sasha blinked twice, breathing through it. "I was driving, he stepped out. I didn't see him. I panicked, and I ran." Her jaw clenched. Her next words came like confession and defense all at once. "My lawyer told me to say I wasn't. He told me the video would never come out, that I should protect the family name, that admitting it would destroy everything." She paused. Her eyes flicked to the camera, then to Jasmine. "I believed him." Jasmine didn't nod, didn't flinch. She sat still, absorbing the weight of what had just been said, but her eyes remained locked, not on Sasha, but straight through the camera lens. Then she leaned forward. "They told me I was a political opportunist," she said. They said I was tearing down a legacy, breaking a sisterhood, trying to destroy a family. But the person I think about every single time I speak isn't sitting at this table. Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from something deeper: memory, purpose. The person I think about is dead, hid in silence, buried in silence, and forgotten in silence. A pause. The room felt smaller, the lights harsher. I didn't come here to watch someone cry, Jasmine said quietly. I came here to ask why someone like Luis Mendez could die without a headline, without a face, without a single person standing up, while the person who left him there gets a national stage to explain why she ran. Sasha didn't respond immediately. Her hands trembled slightly, knotted in her lap. She inhaled once, hard. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, she said, voice breaking. I didn't think I was running from a person. I thought I was running from the storm I knew would follow. You were never the one in the storm, Jasmine replied. You were the one the storm was built to protect. For a full 30 seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier than any exchange of words. Outside, millions of viewers sat frozen, some devastated, some enraged, all witnessing something rawer than any press conference or hearing could deliver. In the background, CNN's control director gestured to cut to commercial, but the executive producer shook his head. Not yet. Sasha looked up again. So what happens now? Jasmine answered without hesitation. That depends on whether we let this moment be the end of a story or the beginning of an actual reckoning. And in that moment, with every spotlight burning hot and the full weight of two Americas colliding on one stage, neither of them blinked. The chamber was packed. A rare, full quorum on the House floor. The gallery above brimmed with journalists, lobbyists, and restless staffers, all waiting. Not for a speech, not for debate, but for a number. The vote. It had taken weeks of closed-door wrangling, hours of bitter committee clashes, and days of public outcry that refused to be silenced. The motion on the table was unprecedented. To formally open a special investigation into alleged federal obstruction surrounding the 2022 crash that killed Luis Alberto Mendez, and to determine whether political influence had suppressed accountability. The motion did not name Sasha Obama directly, but everyone in the room knew what it meant. This was no longer a political talking point. This was legal fire drawn in ink and statute. When the roll call began, the room froze. One by one, names rang out over the speakers, some crisp, others trembling, all recorded into history. Yes. No. Yes. No. On screens lining the back wall, tallies formed in real time, red and green dots ticking upward like a national pulse under pressure. At 2:18, the room tilted. At 2:25, the noise in the gallery began to shift. At 2:30, the final yes rang out, and the gavel dropped like thunder. Motion passed, 230 in favor, 205 against. The decision echoed far beyond the marble walls. Cable news erupted. Some anchors celebrated it as a long overdue reckoning. Others warned of weaponized justice and partisan persecution. But the numbers didn't care about spin. The investigation was real, authorized, funded, and for the first time in modern history, the path was now cleared for Congress to question not just civil servants, but the most protected circles of American power. Within the hour, subpoenas began rolling out. DOJ liaisons were contacted, internal records were ordered, and then the one notice that truly shifted the ground was issued. Sasha Obama was formally summoned to testify under oath. The letter arrived not by press, not by leak, but by certified courier, handed to her attorney's office with a timestamp, signature, and instruction to appear within 7 business days before the Special Oversight Subcommittee. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was simply federal, binding, unavoidable. She was no longer a bystander in a political firestorm. She was now a named participant in a legal process that would be etched into history. Inside her D.C. residence, Sasha received the news in silence. No cameras, no speech. Just a printed copy delivered to her by her legal team. For a long time, she stared at the words without reading them aloud. Then she folded the paper in half, placed it on the table, and whispered to no one in particular, "I knew it would come to this." Outside, a different wind had begun to blow. Protesters gathered at both ends of the Capitol, some holding signs that read, "Justice delayed is justice denied," others holding portraits of Sasha from her childhood, framing her as a victim of political vengeance. But inside the committee chambers, the tone was clear. The time for emotion had passed. Now came testimony, records, evidence, timelines. The House had made its choice, not to assume guilt or innocence, but to say out loud, "This demands to be examined." And Jasmine Crockett, standing outside the rotunda that night under a low October sky, didn't smile or speak to reporters. She simply looked up, exhaled once, and said quietly to her aide, "Now they can't unhear it, now they have to look." Because now, finally, the truth had a subpoena, and it was walking through the front door. The subpoena had shaken Capitol Hill. But outside its walls, the world had already passed judgment, and what America had tried to contain as a legal dispute, the global press had named for what it truly was, a betrayal wrapped in silence. It didn't take long. Once the congressional vote went public and Sasha Obama was officially summoned to testify, the world turned its full attention to the story and gave it a name: the scandal of silence. That phrase appeared first in an op-ed from the Times of London, then spread like wildfire through the international press, crystallizing what many around the globe already felt. This wasn't just a scandal, it was an indictment of the very idea that America was still morally exceptional. El País called it an act of cowardice at the highest levels of influence. The Sydney Morning Herald referred to it as the moment the illusion of ethical legacy crumbled. In South Africa, a major paper ran the headline, "She died in the spotlight. He died in the dark." It wasn't just Sasha under scrutiny, it was every institution that had enabled her silence. In countries where power routinely shields the privileged, the story hit a nerve. In Brazil, commentators compared it to Petrobras. In France, where class immunity was a national wound, editorialists asked how a man like Luis Mendez could disappear from the narrative of the world's most powerful democracy. Tokyo's NHK offered a chilling reflection. If America cannot tell the truth when it concerns its most admired names, what chance does anyone else have? Meanwhile, Kenyan journalists, long proud of the Obama name, expressed quiet grief. One article in the Daily Nation read, "For years we celebrated the symbol. Today we mourn the silence." What shocked foreign analysts most was not the crime. It was the concealment, the paper trail of redacted memos, the closed LAPD file, the sudden disappearance of surveillance footage from public record, the absence of a single federal charge. All of it fed a growing sense that America's justice system was not only flawed, but selectively blind. And Jasmine Crockett? She became a symbol too. Not of rebellion, but of refusal. Refusal to let silence have the last word. Back in D.C., Jasmine watched the coverage from her office late into the night. The floor around her was littered with folded newspapers and printed articles, her desk a collage of global reaction. Every page told her two things: the world was watching, and the weight she was carrying was now heavier than ever. Some articles praised her as a lone voice who forced a superpower to look in the mirror. Others, especially from U.S. outlets, accused her of exploiting grief for political edge. But even the worst of them could not change the fact that a man had died, and for a full year, no one in power had spoken his name. Jasmine had never intended to go global. She wasn't aiming for a movement, a legacy, or a headline. All she had wanted was accountability. What she had unearthed instead was a wound deeper than she imagined, a culture that revered transparency only until it touched the wrong last name. And in exposing that, she had made herself a target. But something had shifted, something irreversible. Now Luis Alberto Mendez, an undocumented worker, a man without a microphone, without a platform, without a famous family, was being written about in Nairobi, Paris, Seoul, and Rio. His name was no longer just a line in a forgotten report. It was a reckoning. It was a demand. It was a headline. And Jasmine Crockett had made sure the world didn't forget it. The world had watched the scandal unfold, the silence shatter, and the reckoning begin. Now all eyes turned to the courtroom, where Sasha Obama would finally confront the consequences of her actions, not as a former first daughter, but as a citizen seeking redemption. The morning air was thick with anticipation as Sasha Obama approached the courthouse steps. Dressed in a simple navy suit, devoid of any entourage or legal counsel, she exuded a solemn determination. The gathered crowd, a mix of journalists, activists, and curious onlookers, fell into a hushed silence, their cameras capturing every step of her solitary walk. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was equally tense. Spectators filled the benches, their gazes fixed on the young woman who had become the center of a national controversy. As Sasha took the stand, the room held its collective breath. She began her statement with a steady voice, acknowledging her role in the tragic accident that claimed the life of Luis Alberto Mendez. She admitted to driving the vehicle that night and to the subsequent decision to remain silent, influenced by legal advice and fear of public backlash. Her words were measured, devoid of excuses, and laced with genuine remorse. "I cannot change the past," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "but I can take responsibility for my actions and the pain they've caused." She then announced her decision to accept the court's judgment without contest, including any penalties deemed appropriate. Furthermore, she pledged to cover all expenses related to Mendez's funeral and to establish a fund supporting his family's future needs. The judge, moved by Sasha's candor and willingness to accept responsibility, sentenced her to a suspended sentence with probation, emphasizing the importance of accountability and the hope for healing. As Sasha exited the courtroom, the crowd outside remained silent, a collective acknowledgement of a chapter closing, not with vindication, but with a step toward restitution. The courtroom had borne witness to confession and consequence. But as the doors opened to the world outside, the true measure of justice lay not in the sentence delivered, but in the truths acknowledged and the paths chosen thereafter. Under the gray expanse of a solemn sky, the courthouse steps became a stage for a nation grappling with its conscience. Jasmine Crockett stood before a throng of reporters, her posture unwavering, eyes reflecting the weight of the journey that had led to this moment. The murmurs of the crowd hushed as she raised the microphone, her voice cutting through the tension with clarity and conviction. "Justice is not vengeance," she declared. "It's the restoration of truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable." Her words resonated beyond the immediate audience, echoing through the airwaves into homes and hearts across the country. This was not a victory lap. It was a solemn affirmation of accountability and the enduring pursuit of equity. Inside the building, Sasha Obama emerged, her expression a tapestry of remorse and resolve. She paused at the threshold, the weight of public scrutiny pressing upon her, yet she met it with a composed demeanor. No words were exchanged between the two women as their paths converged momentarily, but their shared glance spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of the painful journey they had navigated from opposing sides. They descended the steps in tandem, not as allies but as individuals bound by a shared commitment to truth. The cameras captured this poignant tableau, a visual testament to the complex interplay of justice, responsibility, and the human capacity for growth. The nation watched, breath held, as these two figures, once emblematic of division, demonstrated that confrontation, when rooted in integrity, can be a catalyst for collective introspection. Their departure from the courthouse did not signify closure, but rather the commencement of a broader dialogue on privilege, accountability, and the imperative of confronting uncomfortable truths. In that shared moment of solemnity, the country glimpsed the possibility of transformation, born not from consensus, but from the courageous act of facing the truth head-on. As the courthouse steps faded behind them and the headlines began their relentless churn, something deeper stirred beneath the noise. It wasn't just about the accident anymore. It wasn't just about Sasha or Jasmine. It was about the fault lines of justice in a nation still learning how to hold everyone, famous or forgotten, accountable. And though no handshake had been exchanged, the moment they exited together had triggered a cultural shift that no one could ignore. The silence that once protected power had been pierced, not by rage, but by relentless truth. And that truth didn't need a megaphone. It had already found its way into living rooms, courtrooms, classrooms, and dinner tables across the country. The question now wasn't who won, but what had been revealed, and whether America had the courage to listen. Because the real story, the one that mattered beyond sound bites and scandals, was about what happens when a nation is forced to look in the mirror and doesn't like what it sees. For every voice calling Jasmine a destroyer of unity, there were others, quieter perhaps, but just as fierce, who called her what she truly was, a disruptor of silence. In a country built on selective amnesia and polished narratives, her insistence on digging beneath the surface wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of love. Love for the Constitution, love for the voiceless, love for justice that doesn't come with a PR team. And that kind of love, it's the most dangerous force in America because it doesn't flinch. The tragedy that started this chain of events wasn't only that a life had been lost, it was that the system had quietly deemed that life expendable. A man had died, no headlines, no candlelight vigils, no calls for reform. Why? Because his name wasn't trending, because his documents weren't in order, because his family didn't have a platform. That, Jasmine knew, was the real injustice. Not that the system made mistakes, but that it only acknowledged them when someone powerful forced it to. And in doing so, the system exposed itself, not as broken, but as carefully engineered to protect those already protected. But this story wasn't just about pain, it was about purpose forged in fire. Sasha, once shielded by every institution imaginable, had finally stepped into the light. Not with lawyers, not with spin, but with a confession. That act alone did not erase what had happened, but it did something more important. It reminded the country that accountability is possible, even for those born into untouchability. And Jasmine, she reminded the nation that speaking truth to power isn't about spectacle, it's about survival. Her fight wasn't just to challenge Sasha, it was to challenge the lie that justice must always serve the comfortable. In every hallway of power, people now whispered her name differently. No longer a rising voice to be tamed, Jasmine Crockett had become a symbol of what happens when silence is no longer an option. Her words, "Justice is not revenge, it is restoration," were now being printed on posters, projected onto buildings, and repeated in classrooms. But what made those words land wasn't their poetry. It was the pain behind them, the years of being ignored, the nights she lost sleep over evidence no one wanted, the threats, the isolation, the calculated smears. And yet, she stood. Some say America learned that even its most cherished names are not above truth. Others say it learned that real courage is standing alone until others find their voice. But what Jasmine wanted it to learn was this: justice without discomfort is just decoration, and accountability without sacrifice is just theater. You cannot mourn a dead man in secret and call it justice. You cannot forgive what you refuse to face, and you cannot build unity on a foundation of silence and shadows. So here was the lesson, raw and unfiltered. Truth is inconvenient, but it is not optional. When we let legacy outweigh legality, we betray the very principles we claim to defend. When we elevate reputation above restitution, we crush those already broken. And when we silence the ones asking hard questions, we are not protecting peace, we are protecting power. Jasmine Crockett didn't come to make friends. She came to make change. And if change makes you uncomfortable, that's the point. In a country addicted to closure, this wasn't a happy ending, but it was an honest one. And perhaps that's what America needs most right now. Not another apology behind closed doors, but a reckoning in the daylight. Not a perfect resolution, but an unflinching confrontation with the truth. That is where healing begins, not with polished speeches or viral clips, but with the courage to say, we failed, but we will not hide. So when people ask what this story was really about, let it be this: it was never about destroying someone's future. It was about honoring someone's past. It was about asking the hardest question in democracy: who do we mourn publicly and who do we erase quietly? And it was about what happens when someone dares to flip that script. The body of that Honduran man was buried without fanfare, but his death echoed louder than the silence that followed. Jasmine made sure of that, and though the world may never remember his name, the nation would never forget the storm his story unleashed. Because that's what justice is. Not a verdict, not a headline, but a shift. a shift in how we listen, in how we weigh truth, in how we define who deserves to be heard. And in that final moment, as the courthouse faded behind them and the nation held its breath, two women walked forward, not as heroes or villains, but as reminders. That justice, when it's real, costs something. And sometimes the price is the comfort of pretending everything's fine. Jasmine had paid that price, and in doing so, she bought the nation something priceless, the chance to start over, louder, bolder, and no longer afraid of the truth. But as the crowd faded and the spotlight dimmed, Jasmine knew the story wasn't finished. It was only beginning. Truth had cracked the surface, but now came the harder part, turning pain into power and headlines into change. She stood at the steps of the Capitol, not for applause, not for vengeance, but for something far more dangerous: clarity. The same voice that had cut through congressional chambers and courtroom silence now echoed across the plaza with conviction sharpened by fire. "We do not get to call ourselves a free nation," Jasmine declared, "if truth is treated as a threat and silence is sold as peace." Cameras clicked. Reporters froze. But Jasmine wasn't speaking to the press. She was speaking to every family who had been erased, every immigrant buried without justice, every whistleblower punished for refusing to bow. Behind her, flags waved in the breeze, but they seemed less like symbols of pride and more like reminders of how far the country had drifted from its promises. Jasmine raised her hand, not as a politician, but as a citizen, wounded, unyielding, alive with purpose. "This is not about politics," she continued, her voice never shaking. "It is about power, and the people who have used it to protect themselves instead of the truth." She paused. "And I'm not here to make them comfortable." Her call was not gentle. It was a rupture, a demand for vigilance, for resistance, for memory. "If we let this moment pass," she warned, "we will prove that justice is nothing more than a performance we applaud before returning to silence." And in that silence, she knew the same old games would play out. Doors closed, records sealed, names protected, and the dead forgotten. "We have to break the cycle, not tomorrow, not in the next election, now." She laid out what came next, not as a request, but a blueprint for every person watching. First, a legislative overhaul of how unreported incidents involving public figures are handled. Second, mandatory federal oversight for prosecutorial discretion when undocumented victims are involved. And third, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not just for past abuses, but for the silence that followed them. "Because cover-ups don't rot in the dark," Jasmine said, eyes narrowed. "They metastasize." Then she named it: the rot, the machine, the layers of polite protection that shield the privileged from accountability. She did not flinch as she spoke names, departments, dates, and bills, all the pieces of a system built to forget. "Don't ask why I made this public," she said. "Ask why it was ever hidden." And with that, the crowd was no longer a crowd. It was a movement. Veterans with folded flags, immigrants holding photos, students clutching books filled with stories like their own. 1,000 different faces, now united by one common truth. The system had been weaponized, not against the corrupt, but against those brave enough to speak. Jasmine stepped down. She walked among them, and that's when she stopped reading from notes. "I know what it's like," she said to a young woman in the front row, "to speak and be told you're angry, ungrateful, dangerous." The woman nodded, tearful. Jasmine continued, "But I promise you, if your voice shakes the room, you're exactly where you belong." She turned to the crowd. "Use it. Don't let them make you doubt it, because silence isn't strength, it's surrender." From there, it became more than a rally. It became a reckoning. Veterans rose to demand clearer whistleblower protections for service members reporting internal abuses. Young lawmakers pledged bipartisan support for Jasmine's proposed bill, tentatively named the Silent Truth Act. And the media? For once, they stopped asking, "Is she going too far?" and started asking, "Why did no one go this far before?" But Jasmine knew one speech wouldn't be enough, so she issued a challenge to Congress, to governors, to judges, and most of all, to ordinary people. "Watch how they vote," she said. Watch who suddenly goes quiet. Watch who tries to bury this moment in procedural fog. Then came the final blow. And if they do, vote like your voice is the only one left, because sometimes it is. The days that followed were nothing short of electric. Hashtags became town halls. Court documents were unsealed. Families who had once whispered their grief now spoke boldly, carrying photos of sons and daughters once deemed unworthy of press coverage. Jasmine returned to Washington not with a motorcade, but with a caravan of survivors. Their presence wasn't symbolic, it was tactical. "We are not here for pity," she said on the House floor. "We are here for power." And power finally began to tremble. An emergency hearing was scheduled to address the Silent Truth Act. A Republican senator from Utah, once dismissive of Jasmine's tactics, reversed his stance after hearing from a Gold Star mother whose son's wrongful death had been buried in red tape. A progressive from California offered an amendment that would bar any federal agency from suppressing incident reports involving minors or marginalized communities. The momentum was real and fragile. Jasmine knew that for every step forward, there would be forces trying to shove them back into silence. So she pushed harder, called out agencies by name, exposed backdoor memos, invited journalists to ride along as she visited migrant shelters and police stations, real places with real stories that couldn't be sanitized for prime time. "If you're comfortable," she told them, "you're not close enough to the truth." And in that truth, a new call began to rise, not from her, but from the people. Protest signs now read, "Silence is complicity." Murals appeared in cities across the country, not of Jasmine alone, but of nameless figures drawn in shadow, reminding the public of those who still lack justice. Teachers rewrote curriculums. Faith leaders gave sermons on institutional accountability. Even a few talk show hosts, once dismissive, opened their programs by quoting her final courtroom words. "Justice is not revenge. It is restoration." Still, the attacks came. Smears, editorials, threats. "She's dividing the country," they said. "She's weaponizing grief." Jasmine answered only once. I'm uncovering the weapons that have always been there. I'm just not pretending they're flowers." She didn't expect everyone to agree. She expected them to listen, and once they listened, to act. "Start where you are," she told college students. "If you're in law, demand transparency. If you're in media, stop shrinking the story. If you're in politics, choose courage over comfort. And to those not in power, you don't need a podium, you need persistence. They built this system hoping you'd give up. Don't." And that's where her call still echoes. In courtrooms being reformed, in legislative sessions now forced to debate the uncomfortable, in homes once silent now telling truths at dinner tables, in the trembling hands of a father reading a new policy written in memory of a son he lost. This was not the end of a scandal. It was the beginning of a country remembering what truth sounds like, and the beginning of millions learning that when justice whispers, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to scream. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside the Capitol's most watched hearing of the year, Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Nancy Mace after a 17-second racial insult that mocked the name of Jasmine's mother, a nurse who served for 43 years without ever being allowed through the front door. Mace thought it was just another joke, but within 3 minutes, one sentence from Jasmine left her speechless, and the entire room stunned. When the world hears what she said, will they keep laughing with the powerful, or finally stand with the ones they stepped over? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the Grand Hall of Liberty University, everything looked polished and professional. Bright lights lit up the stage and rows of guests filled the seats. The event was called the Women's Heritage and Leadership Summit, a big conference about women in politics, broadcast live across the country. On the surface, it looked respectful and balanced, but underneath there was tension. Jasmine Crockett had been invited to represent progressive black women in leadership. She arrived quietly, wearing a dark navy suit and carrying a leather notebook. She didn't come for attention. She came prepared. Walking just a few steps behind her was her mother, Althea, an older woman with gray-streaked hair and a deep red shawl. She didn't say a word. Jasmine didn't take her backstage. Instead, she walked her to the very last row in the auditorium, a quiet corner, and gently said, "You'll see everything from here." Althea sat down, folded her hands, and stayed still. No cameras pointed at her. No one noticed her. But she was exactly where she needed to be. Across the room, Nancy Mace arrived with a completely different energy. She walked fast, heels clicking, followed by her staff. Her voice was loud. Her expression was confident, even a little smug. She waved at donors, smiled for cameras, and looked like she was ready to win something. When she found out she'd be sitting across from Jasmine Crockett, she grinned and said, "Well, this should be interesting," in a tone that sounded more like a threat than a joke. Her press team fixed her microphone. The moderator, a nervous older professor, checked his notes. Lights dimmed a little. The cameras started recording. But no one, not even the media crew, looked toward the back of the room. They didn't notice the quiet woman sitting in the shadows. What they didn't know yet was this. The most important person in the building wasn't on stage. Not yet. The stage had only just settled. Spotlights warmed the room, chairs creaked as people leaned forward, and the moderator had barely introduced the first topic when Nancy Mace took the microphone and chose something else entirely. She smiled. Not wide, not warm, just enough to make the moment feel casual. Her voice came out light, polished, like a joke between friends. "You know," she began, "I've always had deep respect for women of color." She paused, letting the words hang like a compliment. "One of the best housekeepers I ever hired was this sweet lady. I think her name was—" She scrunched her brow, pretending to think hard. "Althea? No, wait. Althea? Something like that." Her smile turned sharper, eyes flicking to Jasmine with a glint of performance. "You know the kind of names I mean. You probably hear them all the time. Real traditional, real African." The last word landed like broken glass dropped in a quiet room. There was no laughter, just a few awkward chuckles near the back, a nervous donor who didn't know where to look, a staffer whose pen froze mid-note. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. It wasn't outrage. It was recognition. Everyone in that room knew exactly what had just happened, and yet no one moved. Jasmine didn't blink. Her face stayed perfectly still, but her grip on the edge of her notebook tightened. Just slightly. Enough to notice if you were watching closely. Enough to feel if you'd ever been in her shoes. That wasn't a mispronunciation. That wasn't an accident. That was a deliberate swing wrapped in soft words. A jab disguised as charm. It wasn't just her mother's name being mocked. It was the sound of black identity, reshaped for someone else's punchline. The moderator, an older professor with silver hair and a tie too tight, cleared his throat. His fingers scrambled to flip to the next question. Congresswoman Mace," he tried, voice wobbling. "Perhaps we can—" But he stopped. Even he knew. The room had changed. Some people looked at Jasmine. Most looked away. Not because they didn't care, but because they weren't ready to meet her eyes. The kind of quiet that filled the space now wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the kind that comes when someone crosses a line and no one's quite sure who's going to fix it. The room was already tense from Mace's mockery of Jasmine's mother's name, but instead of stopping, she leaned forward, as if she hadn't gone far enough. The silence didn't stop her. It invited her. Nancy Mace looked directly at Jasmine, her tone light but laced with sarcasm. "So, Jasmine," she said slowly, dragging out each word as if choosing them carefully but carelessly all at once. "Where's your mom from again? Kenya? Harlem?" A few heads turned sharply, and then came the last word, delivered with a smile that felt like spit. "Wakanda?" The word didn't land like a joke. It landed like a slap. It wasn't just offensive. It was meant to shrink Jasmine down to a stereotype. It mocked her heritage, erased her reality, and tried to turn her mother's life into a cartoon reference. Mace didn't stumble into this. She chose it. Every word was measured. Every word was meant to sting without looking like it did. Cameras immediately turned toward Jasmine. The room waited. Her face didn't change, but her body did. Her fingers dug deeper into the edge of her leather notebook, her knuckles tightening just enough to turn pale. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. But inside you could feel it. The fire building behind her eyes, not in rage, but in restraint. A student near the front, a young black woman, slowly removed her glasses, her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes stayed fixed on Jasmine, as if silently asking, will she say something? Will someone stop this? The moderator looked like he might speak, but he didn't. His lips parted, then shut again. He stared at his note cards, pretending to read, pretending the moment hadn't just happened. But it had, and everyone in the room knew it. What Mace had said couldn't be undone, and what Jasmine was holding back couldn't stay buried for long. The insult still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't turn. She didn't blink. Instead, she let the silence do what it was built to do, carry memory. And in that silence, her body remained in the auditorium, but her mind was gone. It had returned to a classroom in East Texas, to a day she had buried but never escaped. She was 12. It was Spirit Week at her mostly white middle school, and the theme was Crazy Hair Day. Jasmine had chosen to wear her natural curls out, high, wide, proud. Her mother had helped her that morning, gently shaping each coil, smoothing the edges, calling her a crown with no apology. Jasmine remembered the joy, the mirror, the way the sun hit her hair just right. But when she walked into homeroom, it changed. A boy 3 desks behind her squinted and said loudly, "What is that? You look like an Ethiopian microphone." Laughter exploded, full, careless, cruel. The kind of laughter that isn't just heard, it's felt. She remembered how it vibrated through her chest, how her smile collapsed like wet paper. The teacher tried to quiet them, but never addressed the comment. Jasmine sat there, eyes fixed on the lines of her notebook, refusing to look up. Her hands shook then too. That night, Jasmine didn't tell her mother what happened. She didn't have to. Althea could see it in the way her daughter sat at the kitchen table. Untouched food in front of her, curls tied back in a tight knot as if to erase the morning. Althea didn't ask. She didn't lecture. She simply placed one hand on Jasmine's shoulder and said in a voice that was steady, quiet, and unshakable, "Don't scream in a battlefield. Let your existence be the thing that shuts them up." Jasmine never forgot those words. They didn't sound like comfort. They sounded like steel, like armor. And now, all these years later, on that stage with cameras rolling and the sting of Nancy Mace's mockery still fresh in the air, Jasmine looked down at her palms. Slight tremor, controlled breath. She pressed her thumb gently into the soft leather of her notebook, not for grounding, but for gathering. She wasn't panicked. She was remembering who taught her how to stand still in a storm. And that stillness wasn't silence. It was strength. Real strength. The kind you don't need to explain. The kind that knows how to wait for the exact right moment to strike back with something louder than anger. Truth. Jasmine sat still, calm on the outside but bracing inside. But before she could speak, before she even needed to, another voice rose. One stronger, one older, one shaped by decades of storms. From the last row of the hall, a woman stood up. No one had invited her. No one had noticed her until that moment. But now the room turned to her like she had pulled gravity toward herself. Althea Crockett, Jasmine's mother, rose slowly, shoulders squared, eyes clear. There was no trembling in her frame, no hesitation in her breath, just a quiet force building behind her presence. And when she spoke, her voice didn't shout, but it carried. It commanded. "I didn't come here to be spoken about," she said, her tone calm but cutting. "But if someone's going to use me to get a laugh, at least say my name right." The words rang out with perfect clarity, louder than any insult spoken earlier. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The power was in how steady it was, how controlled, how deeply it landed. The effect was instant. The room froze. The moderator blinked, visibly panicked, but said nothing. Nancy Mace lowered her eyes and started rifling through her papers, not to find something, but to avoid everything. Her fingers twitched, desperate to look busy, but her silence betrayed her. Because in that moment, everyone knew she had been answered, and not by the daughter she tried to provoke, but by the mother who had seen this kind of cruelty before and survived it. Althea didn't come to fight. She came to remind the room that respect isn't something you request. It's something you embody. And even the deepest prejudice couldn't drown a voice like hers. She took one small step forward from the back of the room, her heels making the faintest sound on the polished wood floor. There was no microphone in her hand, no spotlight above her. And yet every person in the auditorium turned to face her like she had summoned something older, deeper, and far more real than anything said from the stage that day. Her eyes lifted, not confrontationally but steadily, toward the row of panelists, toward the podium, toward the very air where her name had just been twisted into a punchline. Her voice carried no anger, only something firmer than rage, truth spoken without fear. I used to scrub the floors for men who now have buildings named after them, Althea said, her tone steady, unshaken. Men who were powerful, who gave speeches, shook hands, wore medals. But let me tell you something. None of them ever felt the need to mock someone just to feel important. Her eyes were calm, her words deliberate. Not one of them ever turned a woman's name into a punchline. Not one tried to shrink someone down just to stand taller themselves. I've seen pride, I've seen ego, but I have never seen real honor come from cruelty. She paused, scanning the stage, not seeking a reaction, just stating a fact. So if you're going to talk about leadership and legacy, she added, then at least start by pronouncing a name with respect. Her words didn't echo. They settled. Like a weight the room suddenly realized had been sitting on their chest the whole time. She let the silence settle around her. She didn't fill it. She didn't rush to the next point. She allowed it to sit, let it sting. Let the room feel the weight of what they'd allowed to pass only moments ago as a joke. She didn't look for validation. She didn't glance at Jasmine, or Mace, or the cameras that had now quietly panned away from the stage. Her eyes were fixed forward, not on a face, but on the principle. And that made it all the more devastating. Nancy Mace, just minutes before so smug in her posture, had now gone still. Her fingers fiddled with her pages, but not to prepare, just to avoid eye contact. The moderator stared at his cue cards like they were written in a language he no longer understood. Across the audience, students sat frozen, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Something rare was happening, something raw. And then from the third row, a soft whisper slipped into the silence. Gentle, but unforgettable. She doesn't need a mic, the student said. She is the mic. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Because in that moment, no one could deny it. Althea Crockett had taken a moment of disrespect and turned it into a reckoning, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, simply by telling the truth so plainly, so fully, that it left no room for retreat, no cover for sarcasm, no mask for power. She was not there to perform. She was there to remind them. Respect is not granted by title or spotlight or scripted applause. It is earned by how you speak when no one expects you to be heard. And that, more than anything said from the stage that day, was the real legacy in the room. The silence that followed Althea's words wasn't hollow. It was heavy, like the room itself had just remembered something it had long tried to forget. Jasmine stood still at the podium, the quiet pressing against her back like a tide. She hadn't planned to speak next, but history was asking her to continue what her mother had just begun. Jasmine opened her leather-bound notebook, not for show, not to stall, but because some truths deserved the weight of being read, not improvised. Her voice emerged, low and steady, but laced with something deeper, like she was calling something back from the walls. Her name, she said, letting each word land like a hammer, is Althea Josephine Grant. She was a nurse. She is my mother. And in the spring of 1972, she was told she could not enter the hospital through the front doors, not because she lacked the training, not because she lacked the heart, but because she wore brown skin in a white coat. She let the words settle, watching them sting. Her eyes scanned the front row, not searching for approval, just making sure no one looked away. She served in the trauma ward, Jasmine continued, bandaged gunshot wounds, delivered babies, held the hands of dying men whose own families wouldn't show up. But after every shift, she had to leave the building the way she came, through the alley, past the dumpsters, where no patients would ever see her. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. Each word was a scalpel, cutting through comfort, exposing the rot. Then gently she lifted a small photo from the notebook. The audience leaned in. This, she said, raising it so the cameras could catch it, was taken the week they promoted her to senior nurse. She just finished a double shift. That uniform wasn't gray when she started. It was white. In the faded picture, a young black woman stood in the shadow of the county hospital, her back straight, her eyes defiant, her shoes soaked from cleaning blood off a floor she was never allowed to walk proudly across. Jasmine's hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of memory. She placed the photo on the podium like a sacred object and looked out again at the faces before her. "Nobody invited my mother to speak here today," she said, her voice dipping, thick with emotion, but never cracking. "No one thought she'd stand. But that's the thing. She didn't need an invitation, and she didn't wait for permission. She stood because she has spent her entire life being stepped over, talked over, and dismissed, and still she never once forgot who she was." She paused, then looked directly at Nancy Mace, whose eyes were now fixed on the edge of her papers like they might catch fire. Jasmine didn't flinch. "My mother taught me that dignity doesn't come from who hands you the microphone. It comes from what you say when the whole room is hoping you'll stay quiet." Her voice hardened slightly now, still calm, still in control, but radiating truth that could not be ignored. She told me, "Make them hear you even if they won't listen. Make the silence around you work for you, not against you." And today you heard her. Whether you meant to or not, you heard her. The silence that followed her mother's words wasn't just quiet, it was a reckoning. And when Jasmine finally spoke, she didn't need to raise her voice. She only needed to raise the truth. Jasmine straightened her posture. Her eyes remained on the panel, but her words were aimed beyond them, to the ceiling, the cameras, the generations listening silently through every crack in the walls. "Silence isn't absence," she said, each syllable crisp and deliberate. "It's what power fears most when it's running out of excuses." Her voice didn't rise, but the gravity in it did. It landed like a stone in a still lake. No one moved. The audience had heard loud voices before. What they hadn't heard was this: quiet conviction that cut sharper than any scream. It was a statement, yes, but also a verdict, a challenge, a dare. Nancy Mace opened her mouth slightly, as if to interject, perhaps a retort rehearsed in her mind. But the words never formed. Her lips closed again without a sound, because no one was looking at her anymore. The cameras that once eagerly tracked her expressions had shifted. The moderators didn't prompt her. The air around her was no longer hers to command. Jasmine had stolen the momentum without raising a hand, and Althea, still standing in the back, had stolen the room without taking a step. Mace was present, but irrelevant. Althea remained upright. She didn't return to her seat. She didn't need to. She stood like a monument, one not built of marble, but of memory, of resilience hardened by years of insult, exclusion, and survival. Her frame wasn't rigid with anger. It was composed, shaped by decades of knowing when to bend and when not to. Her presence alone was louder than any gavel, more enduring than any applause. And in this moment, she didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence was not submission. It was weight. The room stayed frozen. You could hear the shift of fabric as someone adjusted their collar, the soft buzz of a camera lens refocusing. No coughs, no whispers, only the soft hum of reckoning. Jasmine, sensing the stillness, leaned forward slightly, not for effect, but because the weight of memory was pulling her there. "We're taught that silence is weakness," she said, eyes scanning the crowd now. "But sometimes silence is the refusal to participate in someone else's lie." Again, no volume, just precision, like each word was chosen with surgical care, placed exactly where it needed to land. Behind her, a screen still displayed the faded photo of Althea in her 1972 uniform, creased at the shoulder, name tag half visible, standing beside a loading dock instead of a front door. A living reminder of systems that rewarded obedience but punished dignity. Jasmine gestured toward it without turning. "That's the back door of County General," she said. "That was the front entrance. For women like her." She paused, not for drama, but because the air in her chest was suddenly heavy. And for years, no one asked her name. No one thought her voice mattered. Until today. The words struck like a slow-moving blade. Sharp, yes, but deliberate. Not meant to wound, but to expose. Around the hall, eyes dropped. Not in shame, but in realization. This wasn't just about Jasmine or her mother. It was about everyone who had ever been forced to be quiet just to survive. It was about every truth that had been swallowed so someone else could keep smiling. A young moderator, barely in his 30s, shifted nervously in his chair, clearly unsure whether to move on, cut to commercial, or simply vanish. But no cue was needed, no button pressed, because Jasmine had already seized the moment, locked it in her grip, and reshaped it into something undeniable. There was no going back to scripted questions. Not after this. Althea exhaled slowly but didn't sit. Her hands clasped loosely in front of her, trembled just slightly but not from fear. It was something else, something almost holy. The trembling of a woman who had waited half a century to see someone say the thing she had never been allowed to. Her gaze remained steady, fixed not on any one face, but on the shape of justice itself, standing invisible in the room like a ghost finally invited in. And in that silence, longer than any pause on C-SPAN, heavier than any filibuster, the truth stood naked. No spin, no applause, no escape. And just when the silence threatened to settle forever, Jasmine took one more step into the past, not to escape it, but to confront it head on. She didn't need notes, didn't need a screen. She carried the memory like a scar under her skin. "I was 16, Jasmine said, her voice steady but weighted, and I wanted to quit. Not just school, everything." Her eyes didn't blink, not once. "Every time I raised my hand, they called me by the wrong name. Every time I walked into a room, they acted like I didn't belong in it. Not because I was wrong, but because I was invisible. I thought maybe if I shrank myself enough, they'd leave me alone. But they didn't want me small. They wanted me gone." She took a breath, not shallow, not broken, just enough to gather what came next. "One night I came home, threw my backpack on the floor, and told my mother I was done. I said, 'Why should I keep showing up if no one even remembers my name?'" Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't let it falter. She looked at me, tired, still in her nurse uniform, hands raw from scrubbing, and said something I've never forgotten. Jasmine paused. The room leaned in. She said, "If they don't want to remember your name, then make damn sure they remember your voice." The words didn't just echo, they struck, like gunpowder catching flame. Jasmine's eyes scanned the room, not in search of pity, but to deliver a promise. That was the day I stopped apologizing for being heard. That was the day I realized silence isn't peace. It's permission, and I was done granting it. She took one step forward, as if walking through every classroom, every boardroom, every courtroom that once tried to erase her. My voice? It wasn't perfect. It shook. It cracked. But it stayed. And over time, it cut through the noise like a knife through paper. Someone in the back gasped, just barely audible, but it was enough to remind everyone they were still breathing. Jasmine didn't flinch. "They used to laugh when I corrected how they said my name. 'What does it matter?' they'd say. But names matter. Names carry history. Names carry dignity. And when you strip a name from someone, you're not forgetting them. You're trying to erase them." She paused, eyes sharp as steel. "But you can't erase a voice that refuses to whisper." At that moment, the energy in the room shifted again. The weight of generational struggle settled over the audience like fog, thick, unshakable. Jasmine's voice lowered, but the impact only deepened. Some people get to be remembered by accident. The rest of us, we fight to be remembered on purpose. Her hand hovered near the mic but never gripped it. And every time they misnamed me, they built the woman I am now. Every slight, every dismissal, every "what's her name again?" It trained me not to disappear, but to define. No one looked at Nancy Mace anymore. No one looked at the stage timers or the moderators. They looked at Jasmine, and through her, they saw themselves, their daughters, their students, their younger selves. And for the first time in that chamber, the air felt not just still, but charged. As if someone had finally flipped the circuit on and said, "Now listen." And just as the weight of her mother's words settled into the silence like stone, Jasmine reached into her bag, not for notes, not for data, but for something far older, far more personal. Jasmine's hand moved slowly, deliberately, as if the next object she was about to reveal held more power than any podium or platform ever could. She pulled out a small, worn notebook, its edges frayed, the once deep blue cover faded to a soft gray with time. The room leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by something unspoken. With care, she opened it to a page marked by years of fingerprints, creases, and one faint coffee stain. The handwriting was slanted but strong. It didn't scream, but it didn't whisper either. It read, "Speak when it matters. Stand when no one else dares." Jasmine held it up, not as a weapon, but as evidence. Evidence of a promise forged long before cameras, before campaigns, before anyone in this room knew her name. She looked out at the crowd, not to impress them, but to remind them. "This was given to me by the woman you just tried to make into a joke," she said, voice steady, not loud but sharp as a blade. "I was 13. I didn't understand everything yet, but I knew enough to recognize injustice even when it came dressed in polite smiles." She flipped a few pages forward, each one marked by scribbles, courtroom observations, and underlined quotes. "My mother didn't just raise me to be polite. She raised me to be ready, ready to speak truth to power, ready to stand alone if I had to." The room was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was full of tension, of reckoning, of people realizing they had underestimated the wrong woman. Jasmine tapped the notebook gently, like a gavel against invisible injustice. "This isn't just paper," she said. "It's survival. It's a manual for walking into rooms like this. Rooms that were never built for women like her. Or me." Her gaze shifted to Nancy Mace, who had finally gone still. "When I say I didn't come here alone, I mean it. My mother walks with me. Every sentence I speak, every silence I refuse. That's her handwriting echoing through mine." A beat passed, not empty, charged. "She wrote this on the day I froze during a school debate," Jasmine continued. "They laughed when I stumbled, said girls like me don't have the voice for politics, that we should stay in our lane. I came home crying, and she handed me this. She didn't hug me. She didn't tell me they were wrong. She told me to prove them wrong." Jasmine's knuckles tightened slightly around the book's spine. "So I came back. I didn't win that debate, but I didn't freeze again, and I haven't stopped speaking since." The notebook now rested open on the podium like a second speaker in the room, one made of ink, pain, and persistence. Some of you measure legacy in titles. I measure mine in sentences written late at night, by a woman who wasn't supposed to have a voice, but taught me how to wield mine. Jasmine's tone grew firmer. "You tried to turn her name into a punchline. I just turned it into a monument." As the weight of Althea's words settled over the room, like dust in a storm's aftermath, Jasmine slowly stepped forward, the silence around her no longer empty, but sacred. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The stillness had become her ally, and the air itself seemed to lean in to listen. She turned to the cameras, now focused squarely on her, on the daughter of the woman who had just taken a stage no one gave her and made it hers. Jasmine didn't blink, her eyes locked with the lens. Not like a politician seeking approval, but like a witness delivering testimony. Then she spoke, deliberate, sharp, honest. "You can clip this," she said, voice steady as a steel beam in a collapsing house. "Just don't you dare trim the silence." The impact was immediate. You could hear the breath in people's throats catch mid-exhale. It wasn't a line. It wasn't rehearsed. It was a warning, a command, an accusation buried in velvet. Because Jasmine knew exactly what would happen next, how the sound bites would be chopped, how the headlines would shrink the moment, how social media would rush to turn blood into spectacle. And she refused to let them erase what wasn't spoken. The silence that had fallen after her mother's voice, the silence that felt more honest than any speech given that day, was the real story. It was the part that made people squirm because it said everything without saying anything. And Jasmine, unlike so many who sat on that stage, had learned to honor that kind of silence. Not fill it, not flee it, but protect it. She held the gaze of the camera a second longer, letting the words embed themselves in every newsroom, every clip editor's screen, every viewer's mind. She was daring them. Tell the truth or get out of the way. Then she turned back to the room, her voice calm but no longer quiet. "Nancy didn't ask to understand," she said, each syllable sharp as glass. "She asked to trend." The audience tensed. It was no longer a hearing. It was an unmasking. She wasn't debating anymore. She was documenting. "But some of us weren't raised to perform," Jasmine continued, her voice rising just slightly, not in volume, but in conviction. "We were raised to last." The final word landed like a gavel, not in the sense of authority, but in finality. She wasn't asking for agreement. She was handing out truth, and people could take it or choke on it. Across the stage, Nancy Mace froze. She didn't respond because there was nothing left to say. The smirk was gone. The posture slouched. Her head dipped slightly, not in humility, but in quiet defeat. The cameras, once eager to catch her reactions, now panned away entirely. They had moved on. She was no longer the story. And then it happened. From the middle row, a single figure stood, not loud, not showy, just honest. A young white student, maybe 19, with watery eyes and a hand trembling slightly at his side. He didn't shout. He didn't chant. He simply said, voice breaking under the pressure of the moment, "That's leadership." The words rippled through the hall like a stone dropped into still water. No one clapped yet. No one moved. It wasn't performative. It was reverence. Jasmine didn't acknowledge it with a nod or a smile. She stood where she was, still and grounded, as if the floor itself held her upright. Her mother, Althea, remained at the back of the room, like a monument to everything that had been endured and survived. She didn't need to step forward. She had already arrived. For a few long seconds, the room simply breathed, or tried to. Some wiped tears they didn't know had formed. Some looked down, ashamed of what they'd laughed at earlier. And others, especially the ones who had never seen a black woman hold silence like it was power, just sat, stunned. No speech from the stage that day could match what had just occurred. No legislation, no prepared statement, no consultant-approved line delivered with artificial charm. This wasn't about policies anymore. This was about presence, about legacy, about what remains when the hashtags vanish and the applause dies out. Jasmine's body language never changed. No theatrics, no victory pose. But her silence afterward spoke louder than anything she'd said, because she knew what rooms like this had done to voices like hers, knew how easily truth was turned into content, and she wasn't playing that game. At the edge of the room, a producer in a headset whispered something to a crew member. The cameras were still rolling, but none of them dared pan back to Mace. Her presence had become irrelevant. She no longer existed in the frame of the moment. Then someone else stood, and another. Not out of obligation, not on cue, but because something had shifted, something irreversible. An unspoken understanding was taking shape. That this wasn't just a moment of reckoning for a politician caught being cruel. It was a shift in who got to define strength. A reminder that the most powerful voice in a room doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands still and speaks plainly. The moderator tried to clear his throat, flipping through his notes like he might find the authority to continue. But there was no coming back. The hearing was technically still in session, but spiritually, morally, culturally, it was over. Jasmine had spoken, and more importantly, she had stopped speaking. And in that silence, everything that mattered had been said. As people slowly rose to their feet, there was no eruption, no wild applause. Just that rare, trembling hush that follows the kind of truth no one wants to admit they'd forgotten how to hear. Althea closed her eyes briefly, only briefly, then opened them again. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood there, the same way she had stood in back entrances and emergency wards and kitchens where no one saw her, but where she always made herself felt. She didn't need the spotlight. She was the reason it existed. Jasmine slowly closed the folder on the table before her. Her fingers hovered for a moment above its edge, then rested flat against the cover. The kind of gesture that doesn't say finished, but done. A few rows over, a reporter whispered into a recorder. "I think this is the moment," she said quietly. "The one people will play back when they ask what changed." Another staffer simply nodded. No hashtags, no headlines yet. But something had indeed shifted, because this wasn't just about a politician insulting a name. It was about the weight of that name, the hands that carried it, the voices that built it, the silence that surrounded it, and the daughter who refused to let that silence be mistaken for surrender. Jasmine Crockett had said what she needed to say, and then she gave the silence the final word. And just when the silence had stretched to its edge, taut like a held breath across the room, Jasmine took one final step forward, her voice quiet, but forged in fire. The calm around her wasn't peace, it was pressure, the kind of stillness that comes before tectonic plates shift. Her eyes scanned the rows not with defiance, but with something more enduring, conviction shaped by generations. She didn't raise her arms, she didn't clench a fist, but she carried with her the posture of every woman who had ever been asked to wait her turn, swallow her pride, or smile through erasure. She looked forward, not at the audience, not even at Mayus, but through the moment itself, like she had outlived it before it finished. Then she delivered the final blow, not with volume, but with precision. "You mocked our roots. Don't act surprised when they rise through concrete." The words didn't echo. They embedded, deep, heavy, immediate. The kind of line that didn't ask for a reaction. It commanded one. For a split second, it was unclear whether anyone would move. The audience seemed frozen in place, as if a collective realization had just been carved into their skin. Then from the far right corner of the auditorium, an old man stood, slowly, carefully, but with unmistakable weight. His suit was worn at the cuffs, his knuckles curved by time, and his hair, snow white, trembled slightly as he rose. But when he did, when this professor of American history, who had sat through decades of hearings, lectures, and testimonies, stood without a word, the effect was electric. No gesture, no applause. Just one man rising in solemn affirmation of a truth too long buried beneath pleasantries. And then came the second, and the third. No choreography, no prompt, just movement, spontaneous and reverent. One by one, the audience followed, like a wave not crashing but rising. Staffers, students, journalists, interns, even the moderator, uncertain of protocol but certain of conscience. The air was no longer thick with tension. It was now something else, awakening. No one clapped, no one dared, because this wasn't celebration. This was acknowledgement. Jasmine had spoken, but what stood now was not for her. Their eyes, every last one of them, turned not to the podium, but to the back of the room, to the woman still standing, Althea. She hadn't moved, not a single inch. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers relaxed, chin steady. She didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't soften. She didn't need to, because in that moment, beneath the weight of Jasmine's truth, and above the silence left behind, she became something more than presence. She became proof, not of pain, but of endurance, not of suffering, but of survival. She didn't weep. She didn't tremble. Her eyes, dark, firm, unflinching, met the gaze of every soul now turned toward her, not demanding recognition, but daring people to see what they'd always chosen to overlook. It wasn't performative, it wasn't poetic, it was real. Althea's stance wasn't just about dignity, it was defiance without movement. For decades, she'd been the woman walking through back doors, taking second shifts, raising children in a world that counted her labor but not her life. Now in the most unexpected of theaters, surrounded by power brokers and pundits, she stood unmoved as the crowd finally looked, truly looked at her. Not as a mother, not as a story, but as the root itself, a living monument to everything that had been buried and dared to grow anyway. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her final words had done what no hearing, no headline, no bill ever could. They cracked something open, not just in policy, but in people. For years, generations even, the system had demanded submission in exchange for survival. Today, someone had refused the deal. And the room, whether ready or not, had felt it. A young staffer, maybe in his 20s, wiped his eyes with the cuff of his shirt and whispered, almost afraid to be heard, "I didn't know, until now." A journalist nearby scribbled something onto a notepad with trembling hands. An aide reached out to touch Althea's shoulder, but stopped just short. Like interrupting a moment of sacred stillness would be a sin. The cameras kept rolling, but they had lost their control. The story no longer belonged to the networks. It belonged to the silence, to the roots, to the rising. Nancy Mace, still seated behind her polished nameplate, finally looked up and saw a crowd no longer interested in her. Her mouth opened as if to explain, to justify, to recover. But the moment had passed. Her platform had been stripped away, not with anger, but with memory. Not with chaos, but with calm. The same calm that came when a storm had finally left, and the damage could no longer be denied. Jasmine turned once more, not to face Mace, but to face the audience who now understood why she had come. Not to win, but to remind. Her hands tightened around the folder in front of her, and though she said nothing, her posture told the rest. This wasn't a performance, it was a warning, that from this point on, mockery would meet memory, that every name laughed at, every voice silenced, every history dismissed, would rise just like roots do, relentless, patient, unbreakable. In the back of the room, Althea finally shifted. One small movement, a single nod, not for recognition, but for reckoning, the kind that says, "We've waited long enough." And the rest of the room, those who had just stood, did not sit back down. They stayed upright, not in protest, not in praise, but in witness. Because they knew now, too late for comfort, but just in time for truth, that what they had seen would not pass like news. It would stay, in memory, in record, in the silent spaces between words. Jasmine walked slowly off the dais, not triumphant but whole. She passed by the front row without meeting any eyes, moved toward her mother without hesitation, and paused beside her, not behind, not in front. Beside. For the first time since the hearing began, mother and daughter stood together. No flashbulbs, no podiums, just presence. Two women standing where others had tried to erase them, and still, rising. The silence that followed Jasmine's final line was unlike anything the auditorium had experienced that day. It wasn't polite, it wasn't ceremonial, it was electric, thick. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for respect, it commands it. She stood center stage, eyes locked on the camera lens as if she were speaking to a nation that didn't know how to listen until this very moment. The air shifted. You could hear breaths being held. Pens stopped scribbling. The hum of fluorescent lights above became suddenly loud in the absence of everything else. Then she said it. "You can clip this," she said, voice calm, deliberate. "Just don't you dare trim the silence." Her words didn't need to shout. They detonated in the stillness, ringing louder than any insult that had flown across the room that day. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't soften the edge in her voice, because this wasn't performance. This was a reckoning. Every syllable felt like a sledgehammer against a wall built on mockery and indifference. And the wall, it cracked. Nancy Mace stirred slightly in her seat, opening her mouth to retort. But the cameras didn't wait for her this time. They had already panned away, as if instinctively aware that she no longer held the floor. The frame belonged to Jasmine now, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. Jasmine took a step forward, not toward Mace, not toward the moderator, but toward truth itself. Her tone never changed, but her words hit harder now. Nancy didn't ask to understand, she said. She asked to trend. But some of us weren't raised to perform. We were raised to last. The sentence landed like a closing argument, and a verdict at once. Across the crowd, you could feel the shift from resistance to reckoning. Some students sat forward, jaws tight, eyes wet. Others leaned back, as if trying to absorb what had just been said into their lungs. Even those who had dismissed her at the beginning now watched like people afraid to blink during history. The kind of moment that would be replayed, retweeted, replayed again. And not because it was scandalous, but because it was true. Mace lowered her head. Not in shame. Shame requires self-awareness. She lowered it in retreat. Her fingers fumbled for papers that no longer mattered. Her relevance evaporated like mist under a spotlight. The line had been drawn, not by confrontation, but by clarity. Then quietly a chair creaked. A student stood, white, male, early 20s, face trembling, not from anger but awe. His voice barely more than a whisper, but it echoed nonetheless. "That's leadership," he said. No one corrected him. No one laughed. Because in that moment, everyone knew. He wasn't giving an opinion. He was naming what the entire room had just witnessed. The auditorium seemed to exhale at once. But it wasn't relief. It was realization. That something sacred had just happened, and no one dared break the spell. Jasmine remained still for a beat longer, letting the weight of silence speak for her. Then, with no dramatic exit, no raised fist, no triumphant smile, she simply turned, stepped down from the stage, and walked. No wave to the cameras, no nod to the moderator. Just a steady, grounded exit, as if she hadn't just delivered the kind of statement that could rearrange the national conversation. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor with the rhythm of finality. She wasn't walking away. She was walking through. And the attention? It didn't follow her. It moved. It shifted, almost magnetically, toward the back of the room, where Althea Crockett still stood. She hadn't moved since she first rose. She hadn't spoken since she called out the disrespect wrapped in polite cruelty. She hadn't smiled, hadn't frowned. She simply stood, still upright, immovable, like a monument that refused to be forgotten. But it wasn't stone that held her posture. It was lived pain, lived dignity, the kind of quiet strength built not in moments like this, but in the thousands that led to it. The cameras found her again, not because anyone directed them, but because the moment demanded it. She didn't seek their gaze, but she didn't turn from it either. She stood in it, fully, entirely. And in doing so, she reframed the entire room. One professor, gray-haired, tenure-worn, and battle-hardened by years of fighting for truth in classrooms and courtrooms, was the first to rise. He didn't clap. He didn't speak. He just stood, hands by his side, head upright. A silent salute to a woman who had not asked for applause, but earned something far rarer: reverence. Then another student, then two more, then five. And before long, the entire auditorium had risen, not like an ovation, but like a nation that had forgotten how to honor truth and just remembered. But none of them were looking at Jasmine anymore. They were looking at Althea, still standing, still silent, still steady, not smiling, not nodding, just holding that space with the weight of everything she'd ever endured and everything she refused to let die. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not to be thanked, not to be praised, but as if measuring whether this moment would hold. Whether those rising to their feet were doing so out of inspiration or obligation. She saw them, and they saw her, and that was enough. After nearly an hour on her feet, Althea finally sat. Not out of exhaustion, but because the mission was complete. A truth had been spoken, a line had been held, and the baton, it had already been passed, years ago. Today was just the proof of it. Jasmine didn't pause as she left, didn't glance back at the crowd, didn't wave, because this wasn't about her. A student near the front row opened a small leather-bound notebook. His fingers shook slightly as he wrote, not from nerves but from urgency. He didn't want to forget the words, didn't want history to fade into sound bites. On the top line he scribbled, she didn't need to speak much. She let her daughter speak for a generation. No one needed to read it to agree. Outside the auditorium, the media didn't run the headlines they were known for. No flashy Crockett destroys rival captions. No sparks fly on stage. Instead, most major outlets used just one line. A woman stood, and the nation sat up straight. That wasn't a slogan. It was a reckoning. Because in an age of shouting, one woman reminded them all what it meant to speak, without screaming. And in doing so, she changed the conversation, not just for that room, but for every room that would dare forget what dignity looks like when it rises and refuses to sit back down. The applause had faded, but what lingered wasn't noise. It was the kind of stillness that stays behind when something irreversible has been said. Jasmine didn't walk away from a podium. She walked out of a moment that no one in that room would forget. That silence, that rare, sacred silence, wasn't just absence. It was transformation. It was the moment when history stops whispering and starts staring you in the face. Not as a concept in a textbook, but as a living truth in the eyes of a woman who never asked to be a symbol. Jasmine's footsteps echoed down the hallway, but in every head behind her, a question had started ringing. Not about her power, not about her defiance, but about their own silence and what it had cost. Because that day wasn't about a speech. It wasn't about the headlines or the hashtags. It was about something older and harder to capture, the unspoken contract between power and dignity. Jasmine had not come to burn the room down. She came to remind them that justice without humanity is just noise dressed in law. That leadership isn't about dominating the microphone. It's about refusing to let truth go unheard, even when no one's listening. In every chair sat a person who had once ignored a name they couldn't pronounce, laughed off a voice that didn't rise, glanced past a woman like Althea, not out of cruelty, but out of comfort. That day ripped the comfort away. Because when a woman stands with her past and names the pain, not to beg, not to accuse, but to reveal, something shifts, not just in policy, but in posture, in perception, in conscience. The cameras didn't catch everything that mattered. They missed the way one professor held his hand over his chest like trying to calm something shaking inside. They missed the student who had once joked about woke noise, now staring at his shoes like they had stories to tell. They didn't record the hallway where a young black woman paused to call her grandmother and whispered, "You were right." They do listen when you don't flinch. Jasmine didn't need to win a vote. She had already carved something deeper, a reminder that shame isn't the enemy of progress. Silence is, and that respect, once broken, isn't restored by apology alone. It takes witnessing. It takes holding your gaze on the thing you most want to look away from, and not blinking. In the quiet corners of campus, you could feel the shift. Students weren't just sharing clips. They were writing essays, planning teach-ins, asking professors real questions again. Because once you see dignity under fire and watch it not burn, you don't go back to comfort easily. You start asking what fire you've been avoiding, what voice you've been stepping over, and most of all, why it took a public reckoning to hear what had been quietly said for decades. This wasn't just Jasmine's moment. It was a mirror, a brutal, honest one. It asked every person who had ever benefited from someone else's restraint to finally step forward. Not as saviors, but as students. To learn not just about race, or gender, or justice, but about what it means to show up when it costs you nothing, and when it might cost you everything. Because what Jasmine and Althea gave that day wasn't anger. It was grace sharpened by clarity. It was memory dressed in steel. And it came with a question not spoken, but deeply felt. What will you do with the silence now that it belongs to you? And that, more than any closing line, any headline, any trending soundbite, was the real lesson of that day. And now as the silence faded into memory, Jasmine took one last step toward the front of the stage. Not toward applause, not toward cameras, but toward something harder to reach. The truth people carry home. She looked at the audience, not like a politician scanning for nods of approval, but like a daughter who had walked through fire and returned not with burns, but with purpose. Her voice didn't rise for effect. It anchored. It held. If what you just witnessed made you uncomfortable, she said plainly, then maybe it should. There was no theatrical gesture, just her hands open, her chest steady, her stare direct. Because what happened in this room today wasn't a performance. It was a reminder that when institutions try to erase us, misname us, diminish us, we do not disappear. We document. We remember. And when the time is right, we answer. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in resolve. This country has built entire legacies off of people who stayed silent, who were told to sit down, who were pushed to the back door. My mother was one of them. Jasmine lifted her hand and gestured gently toward the last row, where Althea still sat, her spine as straight as ever, her hands resting in calm defiance. She stood without needing a podium. And still, she led. Jasmine's breath caught for a moment, and the room leaned in. So now I ask you, who will you be when no one's looking? Who will you stand for when the cameras turn away? She paused, the air felt heavier, the room quieter. Maybe you're a student here, just starting to ask the hard questions. Maybe you're a journalist, typing every word, but wondering which quote your editor will cut first. Or maybe you're sitting in the back like she was, too tired to fight but too proud to walk away. I see you. Her words landed like the first drops of a storm, small but unmistakable. And I'm telling you right now, we need more than hashtags. We need more than reposts. We need courage at 2 a.m. when no one's cheering. We need the kind of quiet bravery that stands its ground without a spotlight. She stepped forward again, this time not to deliver a line, but to hand off a responsibility. If you came here to be entertained, she said, eyes flicking toward the cameras, you're already part of the problem. Her tone was razor sharp now, not cruel, but clean. Because the same system that tried to erase my mother's name will erase yours too, if you let it. So don't let it. The pause that followed wasn't empty. It was deliberate. Start asking who benefits when your neighbor's voice is silenced. Start questioning why some names are remembered while others are rebranded as threats. And when they tell you to lower your voice, don't. Instead, ask why they're so afraid of the tone you were born with. One young man in the front row stood without realizing it, his hand clenching the notebook he'd barely touched for the last 20 minutes. A woman near the aisle began to cry, quietly into the cuff of her jacket. But Jasmine didn't dramatize it. She let it be, because this wasn't a scene to manipulate. It was a scar being acknowledged. And to those who sit in rooms like this and walk out thinking they've just heard both sides, let me be clear, racism doesn't have a counterpoint. Misogyny isn't up for debate. And if your neutrality makes you more comfortable than justice does, then you were never neutral to begin with. She turned now, slightly, toward the lens of a live streaming camera. To those watching from home, to those who will clip this, repost it, twist it, listen carefully. You can edit the volume, you can crop the frame, but you cannot erase what just happened here. You cannot trim the silence. And then, with the weight of generations behind her, she delivered the words that would light up screens around the world by morning. You mocked our roots. Don't act surprised when they rise through concrete. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then from the balcony, an elder professor, gray beard, brown corduroy, a man who had once marched with his own mother, stood first, slowly, purposefully. He didn't clap, he didn't nod, he just rose. And after him, one by one, so did the rest. But they didn't look at Jasmine. They looked at Althea, still seated, still strong, still a monument built from every insult she'd outlived. A young white student near the exit wiped her cheeks and whispered, "That's leadership." She didn't say it for the camera. She said it like a prayer. Then Jasmine took one final breath, scanning the crowd. Her gaze wasn't proud. It was protective. "We don't need saviors," she said softly. "We need neighbors. We need allies who don't just show up for the cameras but stick around when the news cycle moves on. We need voters who don't wait until injustice knocks on their own doors to start caring about the locks on someone else's." Her hands came together now, not to signal an end, but a beginning. If you felt something here today, don't let it fade. Turn it into something. Write it down. Speak it out loud. Teach it to someone younger than you. Challenge someone older than you. Ask better questions. Demand better answers. A deep breath. Because this silence you're feeling right now, that's not absence. That's power waiting to be used. And as she turned to walk away, not with fanfare, not with applause, Jasmine didn't look back. She didn't need to. The room was already standing. The message was already moving. Behind her, Althea finally stood. Not because she had to, but because her daughter no longer needed her to hold the front line alone. That battle had been passed on, not with a shout, not with a script, but with the quiet, revolutionary act of speaking truth when it matters most. And as the stage lights dimmed and the cameras powered down, a line quietly surfaced across the nation. Not as a headline, but as a warning. A hope, a call. A woman stood, and the nation sat up straight. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.